Welcome, dear listener, to another cozy mystery in the charming yet deceptively peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. Our tale tonight is entitled Miss Marple and the Poisoned Supper at Elm House. In this story, the observant Miss Marple once again finds that beneath the lace curtains and teapots of village life lies intrigue, secrets, and the occasional deadly deception. Make yourself comfortable, pour a cup of tea, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Elm House. It was on one of those fresh spring mornings, when the daffodils had begun to nod their yellow heads along the hedgerows and the robins chattered cheerfully from their perches, that word of a supper at Elm House began to circulate through St. Mary Mead. The Harcourts were not by nature excessive entertainers. Colonel Harcourt, a dignified gentleman of military bearing, enjoyed his evenings with the Times and a pipe. His wife, Margaret, a woman of bustling energy and social ambition, occasionally felt it necessary to bring a little sparkle into her household by arranging what she always called a nice informal gathering. This particular supper, though seemingly of no consequence, would soon be the talk of the village. Invitations were dispatched on pale blue notepaper, in Mrs. Harcourt's large, sloping hand, sealed with a faint scent of lavender. It was said in the grocer's that only a handful of select persons were asked, which of course caused more discussion than if half the county had been bidden. Among those invited was Miss Jane Marple of the High Street. When she opened the envelope, she read with mild surprise the words, "My dear Miss Marple, Colonel Harcourt and I would be delighted if you would join us for a little supper at Elm House this Saturday evening. Nothing grand, only a few friends, and I always find your company most reassuring. Yours sincerely, Margaret Harcourt." Miss Marple's pale eyes twinkled as she set the letter beside her teacup. She was quite accustomed to being thought reassuring at social functions. It generally meant that her quiet presence soothed the anxieties of a hostess who feared awkward silences or disagreeable arguments. In Miss Marple's experience, however, attend. He was a man in his early 50s, with iron-gray hair and a serious manner. He had tended most families in the district for decades, and was generally respected, though occasionally accused of being brusque. Finally, there was Miss Sylvia Denham, a young lady staying with her aunt in the village. Her presence had raised eyebrows. What claim had she to Mrs. Harcourt's table? But it was whispered that she had met the Harcourts at a London theatre party, and was most accomplished. Thus the company was formed. When Saturday evening arrived, Elm House was alight with lamps that glowed warmly through the tall Georgian windows. The drawing room, with its chintz curtains and mahogany furniture polished to a sheen, smelled faintly of beeswax and hyacinths. Mrs. Harcourt received her guests in a gown of mauve silk, beaming with the nervous cheer of a hostess who longs for everything to go well. Colonel Harcourt stood dutifully at her side, shaking hands in his bluff manner. "Good to see you, Frobisher. How'd you do, Miss Marple? Delighted you could come, Mrs. Phelps." Miss Marple, in a gray dress with lace collar, entered quietly and seated herself near the hearth. She was fond of observing how people behaved when first gathered together. It was often, she felt, in those early moments that the truth of their characters revealed itself most clearly. Mr. Frobisher began almost at once with a comment upon the government's latest policy, and within minutes was engaged in verbal battle with Mrs. Phelps, whose strong voice carried across the room. Dr. Latham intervened to smooth matters, though his expression betrayed more irritation than amusement. Miss Denham, pale and slender in a blue frock, looked uncomfortable, as though she wished herself elsewhere. "Such lively conversation," cried Mrs. Harcourt, clapping her hands together. Now, if you will all come through, supper is served." The dining room at Elm House was cheerful, with its white tablecloth, silver candlesticks, and arrangements of tulips. A pleasant meal had been prepared. A clear soup, followed by roast chicken with new potatoes and buttered carrots. And finally, Mrs. Harcourt's much-praised sherry trifle. The talk practiced precision. Miss Marple accepted hers with a nod of thanks, but did not at once drink. She was watching Mr. Frobisher, who took a hearty sip, set his cup down, and launched into a long complaint about local taxation. It was in the middle of this tirade that he faltered. His words stumbled. He clutched at his throat, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. What is this?" he gasped before sliding from his chair onto the carpet. A cry went up. Mrs. Harcourt shrieked, Mrs. Phelps leapt to her feet, and Colonel Harcourt bellowed for order. Dr. Latham was instantly kneeling beside the fallen man, checking pulse and breath. But within a minute he straightened, his expression grave. "I fear Mr. Frobisher is beyond help," he said. "He is dead." For a moment, silence filled the room. The candles flickered, and the ticking of the clock on the mantel seemed unnaturally loud. Miss Denham gave a little sob and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Mrs. Phelps, white to the lips herself, muttered, "Good heavens, poison." Mrs. Harcourt swayed and clutched at her husband's arm. "Poison? But how? Why?" Dr. Latham's voice was low and stern. "There can be no other explanation. The death was too sudden, too violent." Miss Marple, still seated quietly with her knitting bag beside her, regarded the scene with eyes that missed nothing. The overturned coffee cup, the faint trace of liquid on the saucer, the expressions of shock and fear upon every face. "It is most tragic," she said softly, "but also curious. One wonders how such a thing could have happened in so ordinary a setting as this." No one answered her. The supper at Elm House had been transformed from a social evening into a scene of sudden death, and in the air there lingered an unspoken question. Who among them had reason to wish Lionel Frobisher dead? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. She had no intention of pressing herself forward, not yet. But in her mind already, threads of observation were beginning to weave. Light of morning. A canary sang in its cage near the window, and the scent of toast and marmalade drifted across the table. She spread butter delicately, her thoughts elsewhere. She had slept but little. The image of Lionel Frobisher collapsing at the table remained vivid. Death by poison was never pleasant, yet there had been no panic in her. She had lived long enough to know that evil often found its way into the gentlest of surroundings. The question was not whether it had happened, but why, and by whose hand. The rattle of wheels outside announced the arrival of Inspector Crail from the county police. A solid man with a walrus mustache and a thick brown coat, he walked with the air of one who disliked being hurried. His motor car, still smelling faintly of petrol, drew up at Elm House, and Miss Marple, from her window, observed him mount the steps with brisk authority. By mid-morning, much of the village had gathered in subdued groups at various corners, outside the post office, by the butcher's, or leaning over garden gates, to exchange every scrap of news. Rumors sprouted as fast as daisies after rain. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had always suspected foul play where Lionel Frobisher was concerned. Mr. Trelawney, the grocer, swore that he had seen Mr. Frobisher arguing with Mrs. Phelps only last week about some legacy. Miss Marple neither added to the speculation nor contradicted it. She put on her neat straw hat, took up her walking stick, and strolled toward Elm House, appearing as ever to be the most harmless of elderly ladies. Inside Elm House, Inspector Crail was already at work. The dining room had been closed off, the supper table still bearing its ghostly evidence: cups, saucers, and an overturned chair where Frobisher had fallen. Colonel Harcourt paced the drawing room with military impatience, while Mrs. Harcourt dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and declared that she would never, never give a supper party again as long as she lived. "Mrs. Harcourt," said the inspector, his voice patient but firm, "I must have the names of all who were present last night. We shall require statements from each one." Consider himself a man of practical common sense, he had learned to tread carefully where this seemingly fragile spinster was concerned. "Since you were there, perhaps you can describe what happened. But mind you, Miss Marple, this is a matter for the police. We cannot have wild speculation." "Of course not," said Miss Marple mildly, seating herself with folded hands. "Speculation is always dangerous. But sometimes, Inspector, a little observation can be useful. I noticed, for instance, that Mr. Frobisher's collapse occurred directly after drinking his coffee. That may be of some significance." Crail's mustache bristled. "We are already pursuing that line, thank you." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am sure you are." Each guest was summoned in turn. Mrs. Phelps, robust and plain-spoken, declared indignantly that she had nothing to do with it. The man was unbearable, yes, always interfering, always sneering. But murder? I may have wished him silenced, Inspector, but not like that. And besides, we all ate the same meal. Yet only Mr. Frobisher died, observed Crail. Mrs. Phelps pursed her lips. That may be, but you won't pin it on me. Dr. Latham's interview followed. He was grave and professional. Digitalis poisoning, I believe. The symptoms were characteristic: sudden collapse, irregular heartbeat, convulsions. There are foxgloves aplenty in the countryside, and one with sufficient knowledge could extract the toxin easily enough. Crail eyed him narrowly. Knowledge such as a physician might possess? Latham stiffened. If you mean to suggest, I mean to consider every possibility, Doctor. Miss Sylvia Denham, when her turn came, was pale and nervous. I hardly knew Mr. Frobisher, she insisted. I met him once in London years ago. He was unpleasant. I avoided him whenever I could. That is all. Did you quarrel with him? Her eyes flickered downward. No, declared that Frobisher had cheated at cards in his youth. At the bakery, Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she had seen Mrs. Phelps buying suspicious herbs. Every whispered tale added fuel to the fire. Yet in her rose-covered cottage, Miss Marple considered matters more calmly. She knew from long experience that gossip was like smoke. It might indicate a fire, or it might merely cloud one's vision. She thought instead of tiny details: the faint stain upon one saucer, the nervousness of young Miss Denham, the bitterness Dr. Latham had mentioned. Her mind, precise as her knitting patterns, began to arrange these threads. No pattern was yet complete, but the outline of one began to emerge. She murmured aloud, "When one sees a weed in the garden, it is not always the weed itself that strangles the rose. Sometimes the root lies quite hidden, and one must dig a little deeper. And with that thought, she poured herself another cup of tea, set her needles clicking, and prepared to wait. For she knew, with the certainty born of long observation, that the storm had only begun to gather over St. Mary Mead. Chapter 3. Shadows of Motive. The afternoon sun slanted low across the village green, gilding the tops of the elms and throwing long, sharp shadows over the cobblestones. Though the weather had turned fine, St. Mary Mead felt unusually subdued. Children were called indoors earlier than usual. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed voices, and every passerby glanced over their shoulder, as though death might slip unseen from behind a hedgerow. At Miss Marple's cottage, the curtains were drawn back to let in the golden light. She sat with her knitting in her lap, a delicate baby shawl for one of her many godchildren, yet her needles moved slowly. Her mind was not on the pattern but upon the faces of those who had sat around the Harcourt's supper table. Each face, she thought, had shown something different when Lionel Frobisher collapsed. Some had revealed shock, others fear, and one or two, if she was not mistaken, had betrayed more complicated emotions. She sipped her tea and murmured, "Human nature, after all, is much the same everywhere, whether at a supper." Inspector cleared his throat. "I must ask each of you again, directly. Had any of you cause to dislike Mr. Frobisher strongly enough to wish him dead?" Mrs. Phelps' head jerked up. "We all disliked him. Let us not pretend otherwise. He was rude, interfering, and altogether impossible. But to suggest I wished him murdered, ridiculous. Yes, he mismanaged my husband's affairs years ago, but I have no wish to end my days in prison for a grudge." Miss Marple's quiet voice floated across the room. "It is often the case, Mrs. Phelps, that resentment festers unseen. I once knew a lady in Much Benham who remained angry with her neighbor for 30 years because of a disputed boundary hedge. But when at last she acted, it was not with violence, but with the smallest of pinpricks, planting her own roses where they would outshine her rivals. Still, bitterness may sometimes drive people further than they imagine." Mrs. Phelps gave a huff, half indignant, half uneasy. The inspector turned to Dr. Latham. "And you, doctor, you had professional dealings with Frobisher?" Latham's gray eyes flicked up, then away. "Naturally. He was a patient, though not an easy one, always complaining of this or that ache. He objected to my fees, accused me of overcharging. In truth, he was the sort of man no doctor wishes to attend." Crail grunted. "So you admit there was tension?" "There is tension in every village," the doctor snapped, then softened his tone. "But I am a man of science, Inspector. Whatever else I may be accused of, I did not poison Lionel Frobisher." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "And yet, doctor, you spoke yesterday of bitterness. An odd word unless one had reason to think of the bitterness of certain substances. Digitalis, for instance, has a most distinctive taste." Latham's jaw tightened. "I was referring to the bitterness of character, Miss Marple, nothing more." It was Sylvia Denham who drew the inspector's eye next. She sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale. "Miss Denham," he said, "you told me you had met Frobisher before, in London. What was the nature of your acquaintance?" "Make of it, Miss Marple." "To think that under my own roof. Oh, it is dreadful." "My dear Mrs. Harcourt," Miss Marple said gently, "such things have happened under many respectable roofs. One must not take it personally. As for what I make of it, well, people are rarely as simple as they appear. Consider the garden. Weeds sometimes masquerade as flowers, and flowers, neglected, may wither into something quite unrecognizable. Mrs. Harcourt looked baffled but comforted, which was exactly what Miss Marple intended. The following morning, gossip had swollen like a flood. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared that Dr. Latham was far too clever by half and had always struck her as secretive. At the bakery, Mrs. Price Ridley whispered that Sylvia Denham had been seen crying on the vicarage steps. At the butcher's, someone swore Mrs. Phelps had threatened Frobisher openly in the High Street. Miss Marple, collecting her letters, listened politely and offered nothing. She knew gossip to be like nettles, stinging to the touch but rarely fatal. Yet within each tale there might be a scrap of truth, if one was careful enough to sort it. She returned to her cottage and sat once more with her knitting, reflecting on what she had learned. Mrs. Phelps, a genuine grievance over her late husband's estate and a fiery temper. Dr. Latham, professional quarrels, knowledge of poisons, and a remark about bitterness. Sylvia Denham, a secret in her past, threatened by Frobisher's tongue. Mrs. Harcourt, indebted to Frobisher, perhaps fearful of losing her house. Each had reason enough, but reason was not the same as action. Miss Marple recalled the way Dr. Latham had poured the coffee, how deliberately he had set down Frobisher's cup. Yet she also remembered Sylvia's trembling hands, Mrs. Phelps' angry color, and the nervous flutter of Mrs. Harcourt's conversation. Each detail was a thread, and though the weaving was not yet clear, Miss Marple's sharp old eyes saw patterns beginning to form. She murmured, "Wickedness, like mildew, spreads where least expected." Miss Marple, however, regarded the matter with her usual calm. She tended her garden, deadheading the daffodils and tying up the young roses with lengths of twine. But her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. The hush in Mrs. Phelps's tone when she spoke of the inquest, the faint tremor in Sylvia Denham's hands at the village shop, and the way Dr. Latham carried himself with just a shade too much composure. The inquest was held on a bright Thursday morning in the parish hall, a building that smelled faintly of polish and chalk. The coroner, a solemn gentleman with pince-nez, presided with due gravity. Villagers filled the benches, eager for every morsel of information. Dr. Latham was called to give medical evidence. He stood straight, his voice measured. In my opinion, death was caused by poisoning, specifically by an overdose of digitalis. The symptoms were characteristic: collapse, irregular pulse, and convulsions. Digitalis is a drug derived from the foxglove plant. Administered in small, controlled doses, it can be useful for certain heart conditions, but in larger quantities it is fatal. A murmur ran through the hall. Digitalis. The very name had a sinister ring. Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. She knew well enough that foxgloves grew abundantly in cottage gardens, their purple spires nodding innocently in the breeze. She herself had once overheard a careless maid mistake the dried leaves for sage, with nearly disastrous results in the kitchen. The coroner asked quietly, "And in your view, doctor, could such a substance have been administered without the victim's knowledge?" "Quite easily," replied Dr. Latham. "It has a bitter taste, but in strong coffee such bitterness might be overlooked." The words hung in the air. In strong coffee. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved silently in her lap as she sat among the villagers. She remembered Dr. Latham's remark at Elm House, how he had spoken of bitterness, and how he had himself poured Frobisher's cup. Witness after witness gave the verdict. Inevitable though it was, caused a stir in the hall. Death by poisoning. Administered by person or persons unknown. As the crowd dispersed, conversation bubbled like water on the boil. "Digitalis of all things," cried Mrs. Price Ridley. "Why, my own gardener grows foxgloves by the dozen." "Who is to say?" Miss Hartnell interrupted briskly. "Mark my words, it was that Phelps woman. She quarreled with him over money. Everyone knows it." Others muttered that Dr. Latham's knowledge made him the obvious culprit, while some hinted darkly at Sylvia's secret. Every tongue wagged, but no certainty emerged. Miss Marple walked home quietly beneath the budding chestnut trees. She reflected, as she often did, that human nature was not so very different from gardening. One might see the flower above ground, but it was the roots beneath that mattered most. She recalled a case years ago when a neighbor's prized dahlias had withered. Everyone blamed slugs, yet the true culprit had been a careless boy who emptied a kettle of soapy water into the soil. Appearances deceived. Causes lay hidden. So too with death at Elm House. That evening, Inspector Crail called at Miss Marple's cottage. He removed his hat and sat rather heavily in the armchair by the fire, as though weighed down by the day. "Well, Miss Marple, there we are. Digitalis. Not the sort of thing one picks up by accident. Whoever did this knew precisely what he or she was about." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, offering him tea. "Digitalis is not the choice of an ignorant hand. It requires knowledge, preparation, and intent." Crail grunted. "Knowledge points straight to Latham, doesn't it? No one else in that room could so much as pronounce the word." "Perhaps," murmured Miss Marple. She poured his tea, adding milk with unerring accuracy. "But knowledge alone is not motive, nor opportunity. And, you see, Inspector, there are many ways in which one may come by knowledge. Books, hearsay, even chant the night, and prepared for bed." But even as she set aside her knitting, her mind was clear and wakeful. Somewhere among those four guests lay the truth. The verdict of the inquest had confirmed the method, digitalis. What remained was to uncover the motive strong enough and the hand bold enough to use it. Outside, the church clock struck 9, and in the garden, the foxgloves swayed gently in the spring breeze, innocent in their beauty and deadly in their secret. Chapter 5. Shadows Among Friends. The Sunday after the inquest dawned bright and golden, with sunlight pouring through the blossom-laden branches of St. Mary Mead's orchards. The bells of St. Mary's Church rang with their usual clarity, summoning villagers to morning service. Hats were dusted, gloves pulled on, and the lanes filled with the pleasant shuffle of parishioners. Yet beneath the familiar rituals there lay a tension, as if each face concealed an unspoken question. Who had poisoned Lionel Frobisher? Miss Marple, dressed in her best dove-gray suit and carrying her prayer book, joined the throng. She moved quietly among her neighbors, offering gentle nods and murmured greetings. But as always, her eyes were sharp and unhurried, observing far more than most would imagine. On the steps of the church she saw Sylvia Denham. The young woman's complexion, usually so fair, was pale, her smile brittle. Mrs. Harcourt hovered near her, fussing with a strand of pearls that never seemed to lie to her satisfaction. Across the path, Dr. Latham exchanged a few cordial words with the vicar. but his glance kept straying towards the women. And Mrs. Phelps stood alone, her expression severe, as though silently condemning the very air around her. All gathered in one place again, thought Miss Marple, slipping into her pew. How curious human nature is, that tragedy makes neighbors into strangers, and strangers into enemies. After the service, the village green became a tableau of speculation. Parishioners clustered in little knots, whispering behind gloved hands. "Digitalis," hissed Mrs. Price Ridley, as if the mere word carried contagion. Mark me, it was slipped into his cup deliberately. Miss Marple, passing by, caught snatches. Sylvia's indiscretion, Harcourt's debts, Phelps' grievances. Names were spoken with relish, motives constructed with ingenuity, as though the entire parish had turned detective. She did not linger long. Instead, she accepted Mrs. Harcourt's invitation to tea at Elm House that afternoon. "Just a few friends," Mrs. Harcourt said, her smile tremulous. "One mustn't allow horror to overshadow everything," accepting her cup of tea. The conversation at first was trivial. The weather, the scarcity of sugar, the vicar's sermon. Yet slowly, inevitably, it drifted toward Lionel Frobisher. "It is dreadful to think of it," Mrs. Harcourt said, her hand fluttering to her pearls. "Here, in my own home, I shall never enjoy coffee again." "It was hardly the coffee's fault," said Mrs. Phelps crisply. "Poison is a human choice. Someone at this very table chose it." Sylvia flinched. "Must we speak so plainly?" she whispered. "It seems ghastly." Dr. Latham's smile was thin. "Reality is often ghastly, Miss Denham. But I dare say Mrs. Phelps is correct. Poison does not pour itself." Miss Marple sipped her tea with perfect serenity. She let the silence stretch, then said softly, "I was reminded, during the inquest, of a curious little case I once knew. A lady in another parish was taken ill after a dinner party. Everyone assumed the cook had mistaken a spice jar, but it transpired that her illness was due to her own vanity. She had taken slimming powders containing strychnine, and rather unwisely doubled the dose. Everyone suspected everyone else, until the truth emerged." The room absorbed this anecdote in thoughtful silence. Miss Marple's stories always sounded like harmless digressions, yet each contained a barbed kernel. Sylvia glanced nervously at her lap. Mrs. Harcourt's pearls clicked faintly as her hands trembled. Dr. Latham's smile hardened. Mrs. Phelps alone looked approving, as though the tale confirmed her suspicions. A moment later, Mrs. Harcourt rang for more tea, and as the maid brought in the tray, Miss Marple noticed something curious. Among the cups and saucers was one with a faint hairline crack, hastily mended with glue. It caught her eye because it resembled a cup she had seen before, at the supper, when Lionel Frobisher had been served. "Dear me," said Miss Marple, rising. "Over me too. He promised. He promised to invest in Robert's affairs, to keep the creditors at bay. Then he turned cruel, demanding more. I cannot bear to think of it." And finally Dr. Latham, his voice cool and cutting, remarked, "Lionel Frobisher fancied himself a clever man, but he meddled too far. He hinted to me that he knew of certain professional matters, matters best left unspoken. I warned him not to play with fire. He laughed. The silence after these confessions was heavy. 4 people, each with cause to resent Lionel Frobisher. 4 lives entangled by his arrogance and malice. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently. She looked from face to face, seeing not just words but tremors of hands, flickers of eyes, the tiny betrayals of human nature. When she returned home that evening, the village street was quiet, lamps just beginning to glow. She set her basket on the table and sat by the fire, reflecting. All 4 had motive. All 4 had opportunity. Yet opportunity alone was not enough. Someone had acted, chosen the cup, prepared the poison. The cracked china, the bitterness of the coffee, the too obvious hand of Dr. Latham. These were threads in a tangled skein. She thought of Sylvia's tears, Mrs. Harcourt's sudden vehemence, Phelps' cold fury, Latham's calculated calm. And she thought, too, of the cracked cup, an object so ordinary, yet capable of directing suspicion like a signpost. Miss Marple closed her eyes and remembered another story. A young curate who misplaced his sermons, only to discover that his own sister had rearranged them to protect him from embarrassment. The smallest domestic actions, she reflected, could conceal the greatest of intentions. One must always watch the little things, she told herself, for they are truer than grand gestures. The clock struck 8. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, lit her bedside candle, and murmured a prayer for clarity. Somewhere among her trapped birds, there was fear there, fear and perhaps guilt. Elm House lay at the edge of the village, its neat gravel drive curving between clipped yews. Miss Marple approached slowly, noting the foxgloves pushing up against the garden wall, their purple spires heavy with dew. She paused to admire them, her mind turning again to the poison they could yield when knowledge and intent met. The maid, a pale girl with nervous hands, admitted her. Mrs. Harcourt was in the morning room surrounded by correspondence. She rose at once, fluttering. "My dear Miss Marple, how good of you to come. I was just sorting Robert's papers. Oh, such a muddle. Do sit down." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably. "Thank you, my dear. It must be very trying for you. These dreadful events, and all in your own house." Mrs. Harcourt clasped her hands. "Indeed, I can hardly bear it. Everywhere I look, I see him, that evening, the way he sat, the laughter before. She broke off, shivering. I tell myself it was fate, an accident. And yet, no. The inquest leaves no doubt. Murder. In my drawing room." Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "One must not blame the drawing room, dear. Evil seldom lies in the setting. It is the human heart that proves dangerous." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flickered. "You think one of us, one of my guests?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that people are very often not what they appear. One learns that in a village, you know. The quietest neighbor may have the fiercest quarrel. And those who protest the loudest are often least innocent." Mrs. Harcourt colored, then bent over her papers as if seeking refuge. Miss Marple let the silence draw out, her gaze wandering about the room. On a side table lay a silver coffee spoon, oddly out of place among letters and bills. She noticed, too, a faint stain upon the rug, brown, as if from spilt coffee hastily blotted. Such a dreadful waste, Miss Marple murmured, rising to inspect the mark. Coffee is not easily removed. Mrs. Harcourt hurried to her side. Yes, among us. Memories are like weeds, my dear. If you do not pluck them early, they take root. But tell me, did you notice anything unusual that night when the coffee was served? Sylvia hesitated. Only that Mrs. Harcourt seemed distressed. She watched Lionel drink almost anxiously. I thought perhaps she feared he might say something dreadful. He so enjoyed cruelty. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, cruelty can be its own amusement, but often it is dangerous sport. People grow desperate when threatened. Sylvia bent her head, her hands tightening on the tulips. Do you think, Mrs. Harcourt? My dear, I think many things, Miss Marple replied serenely. But I wait for proof. Proof comes, always, if one listens carefully. That afternoon, Miss Marple called at the surgery. Dr. Latham received her with his usual smooth courtesy. Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure. Do sit down. How can I be of service? She regarded him mildly. I thought perhaps you could tell me more about digitalis. You see, I have foxgloves in my garden, and I wondered. Should I be alarmed? They look so innocent. Dr. Latham smiled faintly. Not alarmed, Miss Marple. Foxgloves are poisonous, yes, but only if one were to dry and prepare the leaves. It requires knowledge, precise measurement. Too little, and the effect is negligible. Too much, and it kills. How curious, Miss Marple murmured. Rather like gossip, isn't it? A little may be harmless, even amusing, but too much, and it destroys reputations. The doctor chuckled politely, though his eyes narrowed. You have a gift for analogy, Miss Marple. I have only observed life, she replied. Then, after a pause, she added, It must have been dreadful for you, as a man of science, to watch death and be powerless. His smile thinned. Yes, dreadful. She noticed his hand tighten on the edge of the desk, though his voice remained calm. Anger restrained, she thought, like a spring compressed. That evening, in her own little garden, missed like a bird just out of sight in the hedgerow. If she waited and listened, it would show itself. That night she wrote a note, in her careful sloping hand, to Inspector Crail. My dear Inspector, I believe it would be most useful to invite all the guests of Elm House to meet again under your supervision. There are certain matters which may profitably be clarified if we speak together. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She blotted the ink, folded the paper, and set it by the door to post in the morning. Then she drew her curtains, laid aside her knitting, and whispered to herself, It is always the smallest of things. People forget, but the garden never lies. And with that, Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, leaving the village of St. Mary Mead to its uneasy dreams. Chapter 7. Threads in the Tapestry. The day chosen for Inspector Crail's gathering dawned crisp and bright, with a brisk wind that sent the churchyard yews into a restless whisper. It was not a formal summons. No one had been arrested, no charges laid. But each of the 4 guests of Elm House understood the weight behind the invitation. They came with wary expressions, concealing apprehension beneath polite veneers. Miss Marple arrived a little early at the vicarage hall, where the inspector had elected to conduct the meeting. She was greeted with the respectful courtesy due to her years, though Crail himself muttered that he was not in the business of parading suspects like ducks at market. Still, he said, lowering his voice as he escorted her to a chair. "It may shake something loose. And if you should happen to notice anything particular, Miss Marple, it'd be obliged." Her eyes twinkled. "I shall do my best, Inspector. One finds people very much like skeins of wool. If one tugs at the right thread, the whole tangle begins to unravel." The first to arrive was Mrs. Phelps, stiff-backed and unsmiling, her gloved hands folded as though preparing to preside over judgment. She gave a curt nod to Miss Marple and sat apart, fixing her gaze upon the polished floorboards. Mrs. Harcourt followed. Mrs. Harcourt gasped, pressing her pearls. Sylvia let out a soft cry. Dr. Latham's brows rose, but he said nothing. Only Mrs. Phelps remained unflinching, her lips pressed in a thin line. Crail continued. "I'll not pretend we have proof enough for a charge. That's why I've asked you here, to speak openly. Each of you had cause to dislike Frobisher, and each of you was in the room when the coffee was poured. I'd like to hear from you in turn." Mrs. Phelps spoke first, her voice clipped. "I have nothing to conceal, Inspector. Yes, Frobisher owed my late husband money which he promised, falsely, to repay. I considered him dishonest, a cad, and a parasite. But I am not a poisoner. If I had wished him dead, I should have told him so to his face. I am not the sort to skulk with powders and plants." Crail nodded grimly, and Miss Marple observed the woman's rigid posture, the pride that colored her cheeks. Mrs. Harcourt followed, her voice trembling. "I was merely his hostess. Yes, he had made promises regarding my husband's affairs, promises that proved worthless. But I could never contemplate murder. The shame of it, the horror, under my roof. I cannot endure the thought." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the nervous movement of her hands, the pearls that clicked like beads of worry. Then Sylvia Denham spoke, her words low and hurried. "I was foolish once, when I was very young. I trusted him. He threatened me with letters. I feared he would expose me, ruin me. But I swear I never harmed him. I could never. I was afraid, yes, but not so cruel." She raised her eyes to Miss Marple's with desperate appeal, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle nod, though she made no comment. Finally, Dr. Latham addressed the room. His tone was measured, his gaze cool. "As you all know, I am a physician. I am familiar with digitalis, and I was the one who declared its use at the inquest. It is true that I poured Frobisher's coffee, but to leap from that fact to accusation is absurd. I poured all the cups, fluttered apologies." Sylvia hurried away as though pursued, and Dr. Latham lingered only long enough to say, in a low voice to Miss Marple, "It is dangerous, madam, to play at detective. Best leave such matters to those equipped for them." She looked up at him serenely. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of playing, doctor. One learns a great deal by merely observing, quite without effort." Their eyes met briefly, and she thought she saw the flicker of something cold before he turned away. That evening, the village hummed with speculation. Word of the gathering had flown faster than sparrows. At the shop, Mrs. Price Ridley declared that Sylvia Denham was as good as guilty, while Miss Hartnell swore that Dr. Latham had a shifty eye. Even the vicar was drawn into discussion, though he shook his head, saying only, "The heart is deceitful above all things." Miss Marple listened with her customary patience. She knew villagers well. Their gossip was a map of fears and prejudices, not of truth. And yet, within their chatter, there were sometimes hints, tiny, unguarded admissions. That night she sat by her fire, reviewing. A cracked cup, a coffee stain on the rug, a spoon out of place. Each small thing was like a stitch in the tapestry. The pattern was forming, though faintly. The next morning brought a development. The maid from Elm House, nervous as ever, came quietly to Miss Marple's cottage. She wrung her hands and whispered, "Please, ma'am, I daren't go to the inspector, but I thought you should know. The night of the supper, when I cleared the coffee cups, one of them seemed strange, chalky-like. I wiped it quickly for fear of being scolded, but I've thought of it ever since." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Chalky, you say? And which cup was it, my dear?" "The cracked one, ma'am. The one Mr. Frobisher had used." Miss Marple thanked her kindly, gave her a slice of seed cake, and sent her on her way. When the door closed, she sat quite still, her hands folded. The cracked cup again, always the cracked cup. She whispered to herself, a deliberate choice, marked from the start. The pattern would be clear. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Thread. The following days in St. Mary Mead were filled with a curious hush, the kind of atmosphere that follows an unresolved quarrel in a family. Everyone knew that something was amiss, though none spoke of it directly. Conversations at the grocer's shop, the post office, or outside the church door always veered toward the supper at Elm House. Speculation grew like ivy, twining around each of the 4 guests, but with no firm grip on any one of them. Miss Marple, however, did not hurry. She knew from long years of village life that the truth seldom appeared with a grand flourish. Rather, it crept out in small, overlooked gestures, a slip of the tongue, a detail no one thought worth mentioning. She sat one morning by her garden gate, trimming a rose bush, when Inspector Crail stopped by. His boots were muddy, and his brow furrowed. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, "I've nothing new. They're all holding steady. No confessions, no fresh blunders. Between ourselves, I'm beginning to wonder if the poison was administered earlier than the supper. Perhaps in a bottle, or some food Frobisher ate beforehand." Miss Marple looked up, her scissors glinting in the sun. "Oh, I hardly think so, Inspector. The maid's testimony about the chalky cup convinces me otherwise. Digitalis is bitter, you know. It would have needed something strong to disguise it. Coffee, most naturally. And then there is the matter of the cracked cup." Crail frowned. "A cup is a cup, surely." "Not at all," said Miss Marple gently. "A crack is like a scar. People notice it. People avoid it. Unless someone places it deliberately, knowing the intended drinker will take it." Crail stared at her. "You mean it was marked out?" "I think so," she said softly, bending to snip a dead bloom. "I think Mr. Frobisher was meant to take that particular cup." And he did. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Harcourt. Elm House stood in its usual had upset his spoon. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Another thread in the tapestry. Later, she visited Mrs. Phelps. Under the pretense of discussing the church bazaar. The widow's house was severe, the curtains drawn, the furniture polished to a shine that seemed to repel comfort. Mrs. Phelps herself received her stiffly, though she could not conceal her curiosity. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to wander toward the supper. "So many little details one notices afterward," she said vaguely. "For instance, I dare say you remember which cup you were given." Mrs. Phelps blinked. "Indeed, I do not. Why should I? I took whichever was nearest. And Mr. Frobisher's cup. It was the cracked one, was it not?" "Yes. I recall him making a remark about it. Something flippant, as usual. He said it matched his fortunes." Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "How very characteristic." Mrs. Phelps stiffened. "If you mean that I had anything to do with his death, Miss Marple, I must protest. I despised the man, yes, but I would never stoop to such methods." "My dear Mrs. Phelps," Miss Marple said mildly, "I should never dream of accusing you. One must merely take note of these small things, for they so often lead us further along." The following morning brought Sylvia Denham to Miss Marple's door. She was pale, her eyes red from weeping. "I cannot bear it, Miss Marple," she whispered. "People stare at me, whisper about me. They think I did it, I know they do. I swear I am innocent." Miss Marple ushered her in, settled her in a comfortable chair, and produced tea and scones. "My dear, I am sure of your innocence. But you must not let fear cloud your mind. Sometimes a memory overlooked may prove important. Do you recall anything particular about the coffee service?" Sylvia frowned, thinking hard. "Only that Dr. Latham poured. He seemed so calm, so precise. A pretense from Elm House." The gathering was small, intimate, deceptively harmless. Miss Marple poured the tea herself, her hands steady. She offered plates of seed cake and sandwiches, then said lightly, "Ah, here is the cracked cup. Such a nuisance, but I fear I am too sentimental to part with it. Do forgive me if anyone must use it." At once, Mrs. Harcourt shrank back, murmuring that she would not dare. Mrs. Phelps drew herself up and declared she preferred a sound vessel. Sylvia gave a nervous smile but said nothing. Only Dr. Latham reached forward calmly. "I shall take it, Miss Marple. A crack does not frighten me. Indeed, it has character." He accepted the cup with smooth composure, and for a moment Miss Marple studied him closely. He betrayed no flicker of unease. But then came the detail she had been waiting for. He lifted the cup, glanced at the interior, and with the faintest movement brushed his finger along the rim, as though expecting some residue. Miss Marple saw it, though the others did not. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and then she smiled. After her guests had departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap. The tapestry was almost complete. Dr. Latham's gesture had confirmed what she already suspected. He knew the cracked cup too well. He knew what it had once contained. Yet, she still lacked the final, irrefutable stitch, and until she had it, she would not speak. For Miss Marple, patience was the surest weapon. She would wait, she would watch, and she would let the guilty weave the last of their own news. Outside, the evening shadows lengthened across the village green. The case was drawing toward its end, though none but Miss Marple could yet see the pattern in the threads. Chapter 9. The Revelation at Elm House. It was Inspector Crale's idea, though Miss Marple gave it her quiet encouragement. A gathering, once more, at Elm House, the scene of the crime, yes, but also the stage upon which all the actors had played their parts. If there was to be a revelation, it must be made there, amidst the very shadows of that poisoned supper. The cracked one, its jagged line clearly visible. Mrs. Harcourt was flustered, wringing her lace handkerchief. Mrs. Phelps sat upright, her lips compressed. Sylvia Denham trembled slightly, her eyes darting to each face in turn. Dr. Latham alone was calm, his gaze steady, his manner collected. Inspector Crail cleared his throat. We are here to speak plainly. Lionel Frobisher was murdered. We have not yet named the culprit, but we are close. And before this evening is out, the truth will be known. There was a murmur, a rustle of skirts, a tightening of shoulders. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her armchair, allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before she began. "My dear friends," she said, her voice gentle, "you must forgive me for intruding upon your private grief. But I cannot help seeing patterns where others see only confusion. It is a habit of old age, perhaps, or of long years observing human nature. And in this sad business of Mr. Frobisher's death there is a pattern, one that now stands clear before me." Sylvia clasped her hands. "Then you know?" "Yes, my dear, I know. And I shall explain, for truth is best seen in its small details. Let us begin with the cracked cup." She gestured toward the offending piece of china, its flaw glinting faintly in the lamplight. From the beginning, that cup has been central. It was not an accident that Mr. Frobisher drank from it. It was placed deliberately into his hands. Mrs. Harcourt, you told me Dr. Latham insisted upon pouring the coffee. And Sylvia, you remembered that he handed the cracked cup directly to Mr. Frobisher, with a jest. This was no coincidence, it was design. Dr. Latham stirred, his face impassive. "You make it sound as though I singled him out." "Because you did, Doctor," Miss Marple said serenely. And the maid's account confirmed it. She noticed chalky residue upon that very cup when she cleared it. The poison was not in the pot. It was already in the vessel that Mr. Frobisher alone was given. Inquiries. I learned that Mr. Frobisher had boasted most cruelly, of certain medical dealings. He claimed to have knowledge of your professional misjudgments, Doctor. Cases where patients suffered from ill-prescribed treatments. He intended to use this knowledge against you, to extort money, perhaps even ruin your practice. Is that not so? A flicker passed across Latham's face, swiftly mastered. He gave a tight smile. Idle gossip, nothing more. But Mrs. Harcourt gasped. So that was it. I remember now. Lionel hinted at something dreadful about you that evening. I thought it merely another of his vulgar jests. Miss Marple inclined her head. It was more than a jest. It was a threat. And threats, my dears, often lead to desperate measures. Sylvia rose, trembling. Then it is true. It was you, Doctor. You poisoned him. Dr. Latham stood as well, his calm mask slipping. You prattle like children. You have no proof, only the idle fancies of an old woman. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, but it is not fancy. You see, Doctor, you betrayed yourself. At my cottage the other afternoon, when I brought out the cracked cup, you reached for it without hesitation. More than that, you brushed your finger along its rim, as though to check for residue. No one else would think to do so, unless they already knew what that cup had once held. There was a silence, heavy and absolute. Then Inspector Crail stepped forward. Well, Doctor, what say you to that? For a long moment, Dr. Latham said nothing. His eyes, hard and cold, moved from face to face, gauging, measuring. At last he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You are clever, Miss Marple. Cleverer than I gave you credit for. Yes, I put the digitalis in the cup. He deserved it. He had bled this village dry, ruined good people, and threatened me besides." Stepped out into the cool air. The sky was streaked with rose and violet, the first stars pricking through. She paused by the gate, listening to the quiet rustle of the village settling into night. The tapestry was complete now, its threads woven together into a pattern plain for all to see. Yet, Miss Marple knew that life in St. Mary Mead would soon resume its ordinary rhythm. Gossip would swirl, stories would grow, but the village would endure, as it always did. And she, for her part, would return to her knitting, her garden, and her quiet watchfulness. For in every village, as in every heart, there were secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 10. Morning Tea at the Vicarage. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning of calm, as though the earth itself had drawn a deep breath after a storm. The previous day's events at Elm House had traveled swiftly, like ripples across a pond, carrying the news of Dr. Latham's confession into every kitchen, shop, and garden gate. By sunrise, there was scarcely a soul who had not heard the tale, though each told it with small embellishments of their own. At the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement had laid out a particularly cheerful breakfast, Miss Marple sat with her teacup in hand. The vicar, Mr. Clement, buttered a slice of toast as his wife poured fresh tea. Outside the window, the garden glistened with dew, and sparrows darted among the hedges. "It is a sad business," the vicar said, shaking his head. "A man set in a position of trust, a doctor no less, betraying his calling so grievously. And yet, one cannot wholly exonerate the victim either. By all accounts, Mr. Frobisher lived a life of selfishness and deceit. It is one of those cases in which the worldly mind says, they deserved one another. But that is not ours to judge." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly, stirring her tea. "Judgment is a heavy burden to assume. But Dr. Latham did not kill for justice, however he may cloak it. He killed to silence a threat to himself, and that you see simplicity." Later that morning, Inspector Crayley arrived at the vicarage. His expression was one of grim satisfaction, though he looked more weary than triumphant. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, taking the chair Mrs. Clement offered him. "The case is closed. Latham has been removed to London. He admitted enough that even the best barrister cannot wriggle him free. Still, I can't help feeling a touch uneasy. He was a respected man, after all." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Respectability, Inspector, is often a cloak. In village life, one sees it often enough. A person may appear most upright, while their little hypocrisies and cruelties go unremarked until too late. It is not the appearance that matters, but the quiet choices one makes when no one is watching." Crayle grunted. "Aye, you've the right of it. Still, I owe you thanks. Without your eye for trifles, we might still be floundering." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Oh, no, Inspector. I merely nudged the threads into place. You had the patience to hold the loom steady." He gave a crooked smile, then rose, muttering something about paperwork, and departed. The rest of the day passed with the village returning to its usual rhythms. At the post office, Miss Hartnell insisted she had always suspected the doctor. Too smooth by half, she declared. Mrs. Price Ridley, by contrast, said she had suspected Sylvia Denham all along, and felt quite vindicated in having said so from the start. Young Tommy at the shop declared it was just like the pictures, while the grocer himself remarked that he hoped people wouldn't stop buying digitalis tincture for their hearts, for it's a good remedy, rightly used. Miss Marple moved among them all with her usual calm, offering no contradiction, only her gentle nods and mild comments. She knew gossip would weave its own tapestry, embroidered with exaggerations. That was the village way, and it harmed no one now. That evening she entertained a few close friends at her cottage. Mrs. Harcourt came, still pale and shaken but grateful to be in company. Mrs. Phelps arrived too, her manner somewhat stiff, though she endure more than we imagine. You may find one day that laughter returns even to those rooms. Mrs. Phelps, who had been silent, spoke at last. For my part, I cannot say I mourn Frobisher. He wronged me cruelly. But I am not glad he is dead either. It is a strange thing to feel both relief and sorrow. That is quite natural, Miss Marple said gently. For death, even of the wicked, leaves behind a hollow. We must learn from it and live more kindly ourselves. As the evening drew on, the conversation turned from somber reflection to gentler matters. The church bazaar, the vicar's sermons, the weather's effect on roses. Laughter, tentative at first, began to creep back among them, like the first birdsong after rain. When her guests departed, Miss Marple tidied the table, folded her knitting, and sat by the fire. The flames glowed softly, casting warmth over the little sitting room. She thought, as she often did, of the curious ways in which evil manifests. Not with grand gestures, not with thunder and lightning, but with the smallest of choices. Placing poison in a cracked cup, handing it with a jest, cloaking malice beneath respectability. And she thought, too, of the resilience of her village. St. Mary Mead would gossip and speculate, yes, but it would heal. It always did. At last she rose, banked the fire, and went to her rest, comforted by the knowledge that for now the tapestry was complete. But she knew, as she always knew, that somewhere in the threads of ordinary life, another pattern would one day emerge. And when it did, she would be there, watching quietly, with eyes as sharp as her knitting needles. The bells of the church tolled softly the next morning, and villagers went about their business as though nothing had happened. But in quiet corners they spoke of Miss Marple, the gentle old lady who saw what others missed, and who, with her calm voice and simple analogies, had brought truth to light. And so